The morning sun cast long shadows across the training ground as Captain Elena Vasquez adjusted the weight of her tactical vest, feeling the familiar press of metal against her ribs. 429 soldiers stood in perfect formation, their boots creating a symphony of synchronized steps on the concrete. The air tasted of diesel fuel and determination, thick with the scent of early morning sweat and the lingering smoke from yesterday's artillery practice. Elena had counted them, always counted them. It was a habit born from her mother's voice echoing through childhood kitchens. Mija, count your blessings, count your steps, count the people who matter. Today, every single one of these soldiers mattered more than they could possibly know. Commander Blackwood strode across the parade ground like a man who owned not just the base, but the very air his subordinates breathed. His jaw was set in that particular way Elena had learned to recognize, the way a predator sets its teeth before striking. She'd seen that look before, in boardrooms and barrooms, in dark alleys and bright conference halls. It was the look of a man who had never been told no by someone he considered beneath him. "Attention!" The command rang out across the field, and Elena felt the collective shift of bodies snapping to position. She stood at the front of the formation, her own posture perfect, spine straight as the flagpole that rose behind her. The American flag snapped in the wind above them all, and Elena found herself thinking of her grandmother's weathered hands folding a similar flag, the one that had covered her grandfather's coffin after 3 tours in Vietnam. Sergeant Rodriguez stood to her left, his dark eyes fixed forward, but his peripheral vision always alert. Elena had served with him for 2 years now, long enough to read the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped once against his thigh when he sensed trouble brewing. To her right, Lieutenant Sarah Chen maintained her stance with the discipline of someone who had earned every stripe through merit, not politics. The 3 of them had become an unofficial trinity of competence in a world that often rewarded volume over value. The base stretched around them like a small city built for war. Barracks lined the eastern edge, their windows reflecting the morning light like watchful eyes. The mess hall sat squat and functional to the south, its chimney already releasing the first wisps of breakfast preparation. Beyond that, the motor pool hummed with the constant maintenance of vehicles that might, at any moment, carry these soldiers into situations where precision meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Elena's fingers found the small silver cross at her throat, a nervous habit she'd never quite shaken, despite years of military discipline teaching her to keep such movements invisible. The cross had belonged to her sister Maria, would have belonged to her sister Maria, if Maria had lived long enough to wear it to her quinceañera. Instead, it had become Elena's talisman, a reminder of promises made and kept, of justice sought, and sometimes found. Commander Blackwood's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. "Today we discuss discipline," he announced, his tone carrying across the assembled formation with practiced authority. "Today we discuss what happens when soldiers forget their place in the chain of command." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd been expecting this conversation for weeks, ever since she'd filed her 3rd formal complaint about Blackwood's treatment of enlisted personnel, since she documented the harassment of Private Jackson, the discriminatory duty assignments given to soldiers with Spanish surnames, and the way female soldiers were consistently passed over for advanced training opportunities despite superior performance records. The military had its own ecosystem, its own food chain, and Elena had learned to navigate it with the careful precision of someone walking through a minefield. But some mines, she discovered, were impossible to avoid forever. Some battles chose you, regardless of whether you felt ready to fight them. "Captain Vasquez," the command rang out, and Elena felt 429 pairs of eyes shift to her position. Elena stepped forward, her boots clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. The morning air seemed to thicken around her, heavy with anticipation and the weight of unspoken truths. She could hear her own breathing, steady and controlled, and beneath that, the almost silent rustle of uniforms as soldiers shifted slightly to get a better view of whatever was about to unfold. As she approached the center of the formation, Elena caught a glimpse of Sergeant Rodriguez's face. His expression remained neutral, professional, but she could see the concern flickering behind his eyes. They'd talked about this moment over coffee 2 weeks ago, sitting in the mess hall after most soldiers had retired for the evening. "He's going to make an example," Rodriguez had said, stirring sugar into his coffee with methodical precision. "Men like him, when they feel their authority questioned, they don't just defend it, they demonstrate it." Elena had nodded, understanding the warning embedded in his words. But she'd also understood something else, something that had been crystallizing in her mind for months. Silence in the face of injustice was its own form of violence. Her grandmother had taught her that, back in the kitchen of their small house in East Los Angeles, while teaching Elena to make tamales and telling stories of her own youth working in factories where women's voices were considered decorative at best, dangerous at worst. Now, standing in the center of the formation, with the morning sun warming her back and Commander Blackwood's cold gaze fixed on her face, Elena felt the weight of every story her grandmother had ever told, every lesson her mother had ever taught, every promise she'd ever made to herself about the kind of person she would be in moments like this. The silence stretched between them, thick and expectant. Elena could hear the flag snapping overhead, could smell the faint scent of jasmine carried on the wind from the base commander's garden, could feel the collective breath of 429 soldiers waiting to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. But there was something else in that moment, something Elena couldn't quite name but could definitely feel. A shift in the air, like the pressure change that comes before a storm. She'd felt it before, in Afghanistan, in the seconds before an IED exploded and changed everything. She'd felt it in her childhood home, in the pause between her father's raised hand and the sound of her mother's tears. This was the moment when everything would change, she realized. This was the moment when silence would either be maintained or shattered, when the comfortable patterns of power and submission would either continue unchanged or be rewritten entirely. Elena adjusted her stance slightly, her feet shoulder-width apart, her center of gravity low and stable. It was a position she'd learned in hand-to-hand combat training, but it was also a position she'd learned from her grandmother, who had stood just this way when confronting the factory foreman who tried to dock the women's pay for talking too much during working hours. "Yes, sir." Elena's voice carried clearly across the formation, steady and respectful, but somehow also unafraid. She could feel the moment crystallizing around them, like water turning to ice, beautiful and dangerous and irrevocable. Commander Blackwood stepped closer, close enough that Elena could see the network of small scars across his knuckles, close enough to smell the coffee and aftershave that seemed to be his permanent cologne. His eyes were the color of winter sky, cold and pale, and somehow completely without warmth. "Captain," he said, his voice just loud enough for the first few rows of soldiers to hear clearly. "We need to discuss your recent activities." The word activities landed in the space between them like thrown gauntlet. Elena understood that they were no longer talking about military protocol or chain of command procedures. They were talking about her reports, her documented observations, her refusal to accept that harassment and discrimination was simply the cost of doing business in a man's military. Elena's hand moved unconsciously to touch the silver cross at her throat. And in that gesture, she felt the presence of every woman who had ever stood where she was standing now, facing down power, facing down tradition, facing down the comfortable certainties of people who had never been questioned by someone they considered lesser. The morning sun climbed higher, and the shadows began to shift across the training ground. In the distance, Elena could hear the sound of vehicles starting up in the motor pool, the ordinary sounds of a military base beginning its daily routine. But here, in this circle of attention, time seemed suspended, waiting for whatever would come next. Elena thought of Private Jackson, barely 19 years old, who had come to her office 3 weeks ago with bruises on his ribs and tears in his eyes, whispering about training exercises that looked an awful lot like targeted violence. She thought of Corporal Martinez, passed over for promotion despite leading her unit in every performance metric, told that she didn't have the right temperament for leadership responsibilities. She thought of all the small cruelties and large injustices that had brought them to this moment. "Sir," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of all those thoughts, all those promises, all those counted soldiers standing in formation behind her. "I'm ready to discuss anything you feel needs discussing." Elena had never planned to be a soldier, much less a captain who would one day stand in formation facing down a commander whose idea of discipline looked suspiciously like abuse. Growing up in East Los Angeles, her dreams had been smaller, more immediate. Finish high school without getting pregnant. Make it through community college without accumulating crushing debt. Maybe become a teacher or social worker. Something that would let her give back to the neighborhood that had raised her. But life, Elena had learned, rarely consulted your plans before making its own arrangements. She woke each morning at 0500 hours, exactly 30 minutes before reveille, in the small apartment she maintained off base. The military housing was adequate, functional in that particular way military infrastructure excelled at, but Elena preferred the autonomy of her own space. She'd painted the walls a warm terracotta color that reminded her of her childhood kitchen, and filled the apartment with plants that required daily attention, small green things that depended on her consistency, her care. Her morning routine was precise, almost ritualistic. Coffee first, strong and black, while she stood at her kitchen window and watched the sunrise over the mountains that ringed the base. She'd learned to make coffee from her father, back when he was still the man who came home from construction work with stories instead of silence. Before the drinking, and the anger, and the night her mother finally said, "Enough," and loaded 2 daughters into a borrowed car. After coffee came exercise. Push-ups, sit-ups, a 3-mile run through neighborhoods where civilian families were just beginning to stir. Elena ran the same route every morning, past the elementary school with its cheerful playground, past the small market where Mrs. Kim sold the best tamales outside of Elena's own mother's kitchen, past the community center where she volunteered on weekends teaching self-defense to teenage girls. The contradiction of her existence wasn't lost on her. 6 days a week, she taught young women how to protect themselves from violence. 7 days a week, she worked within an institution that often protected the very men who perpetrated that violence. But Elena had learned to carry contradictions the way other people carried spare change, as a necessary weight, uncomfortable but useful when the right moment arrived. She kept a journal, had kept one since she was 12 years old, and her school counselor suggested writing as a way to process her father's increasing volatility. The early entries were full of childish complaints and adolescent drama, but over the years, the journal had evolved into something more sophisticated, a place where Elena could untangle the complex knots of institutional loyalty and personal integrity that seemed to define her adult life. Last Tuesday's entry had been particularly difficult to write.
Rodriguez asked me today if I ever regret joining the military. Sitting in the mess hall,
Watching Jenkins harass Private Sanchez for the third time this week, I didn't know how to answer. This institution gave me structure when my family was falling apart. It gave me purpose when I felt like I was drowning in civilian uncertainty. It made me strong enough to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But it's also the institution that protects Jenkins, that promotes men like Blackwood, that tells me I should be grateful for the opportunity to serve while simultaneously making it clear that my service is always conditional on my willingness to accept unacceptable behavior. I think about Maria sometimes, wonder what she would say if she could see me now. She always believed in fighting back, even when we were kids, maybe especially when we were kids. Elena, she used to say, the world is full of people who will try to make you smaller. Don't help them. Elena closed the journal each night and placed it in the same drawer where she kept her service medals and the last letter her sister had ever written to her. Maria's handwriting had been getting shakier toward the end, the cancer making even simple tasks monumentally difficult. But her words had remained fierce, uncompromising. "Promise me," Maria had written in that final letter, "that you won't let anyone convince you that staying quiet is the same thing as being strong. Promise me you'll use your voice, even when it shakes." Elena had made that promise while sitting beside a hospital bed, holding her sister's hand and watching machines measure the slow diminishing of a life that had been lived too briefly, but with absolute authenticity. She'd made that promise, and promises to dying sisters were not the kind of things you could simply forget when circumstances made keeping them inconvenient. Her apartment was filled with photographs. Maria at 15, laughing at something off camera. Their mother at Elena's military academy graduation, pride and worry warring across her weathered features. Elena's grandmother standing in the doorway of the house where 3 generations of women had learned to be strong in a world that preferred them weak. But there was one photograph Elena looked at most often, kept on her bedside table where she could see it first thing in the morning and last thing at night. It showed Elena and Maria at ages 8 and 10, standing in their grandmother's backyard wearing homemade superhero costumes. Elena had insisted on being Wonder Woman, complete with cardboard bracelets and a jump rope lasso. Maria had created her own superhero, Justice Girl, whose power was making bad people tell the truth. Even at 10 years old, Maria had understood something Elena was still learning, that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was refuse to let people lie to themselves about who they really were. Elena tried to carry that lesson into every interaction, every decision, every moment when she had to choose between what was easy and what was right. Afternoons brought training exercises, equipment maintenance, paperwork that seemed to multiply like some sort of bureaucratic organism. Elena had developed a reputation for thoroughness, for documentation that was comprehensive and unassailable. When she wrote up an incident report, it included not just the basic facts, but context, background, supporting evidence. Her reports told stories, painted pictures, made it impossible for readers to dismiss events as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. This attention to detail had not gone unnoticed by her superiors. Commander Blackwood, in particular, had begun requesting increasingly detailed justifications for Elena's decisions, questioning her methods, challenging her authority in ways that felt less like legitimate oversight and more like systematic undermining. But Elena had learned patience from her mother, who had worked 3 jobs while raising 2 daughters alone, who had smiled through countless indignities and small cruelties because she understood that survival sometimes required strategic silence. Elena had inherited that patience, but she'd also inherited something else from the women who had shaped her, an absolute refusal to confuse patience with passivity. Evenings were Elena's own time, precious hours when she could step outside the rigid structure of military life and remember who she was beyond her rank and uniform. She cooked elaborate meals for herself, recipes passed down through generations of women who had understood that creating something nourishing was both practical necessity and quiet rebellion. She called her mother every Tuesday evening, listening to neighborhood gossip and family updates while simultaneously filing away information about which soldiers in her unit might need additional support. She read voraciously, military history and leadership theory, but also poetry and fiction, memoirs written by women who had fought their own battles against institutional indifference. Elena's bookshelves were organized chaos, military manuals shelved beside Maya Angelou, tactical guides mixed with Sandra Cisneros, leadership texts sharing space with Gloria Anzaldúa. On Friday nights, when she could manage it, Elena drove the 40 minutes to the community center where she taught self-defense. The classes were small, maybe 8 or 10 girls between the ages of 14 and 18, most of them dealing with situations that had taught them early that the world could be a dangerous place for young women who didn't know how to protect themselves. Elena taught them basic techniques, how to break free from grabs, how to use their voices as weapons, how to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. But more than that, she taught them that they had the right to take up space, to say no, to fight back when someone tried to make them smaller. Your body is your own, she would tell them, watching their faces as they practiced blocks and strikes and escapes. No one has the right to touch you without permission. No one has the right to hurt you. No one has the right to make you afraid of your own strength. Some of the girls reminded Elena of herself at that age, uncertain but fierce, carrying the weight of adult problems on teenage shoulders. Others reminded her of Maria, bright and brave and absolutely uncompromising in their sense of justice. All of them reminded her why she joined the military in the first place, not to perpetuate systems of power and control, but to become strong enough to protect people who needed protection. The irony, of course, was that Elena was discovering she needed protection too, from an institution she trusted, from superiors who saw her competence as a threat rather than an asset, from a system that claimed to value integrity while simultaneously punishing people who acted with integrity. But Elena had been carrying contradictions for most of her adult life. She'd learned to hold space for both loyalty and criticism, for both gratitude and anger, for both hope and clear-eyed recognition of systemic problems that wouldn't be solved by individual good intentions.
Late at night, when the base was quiet and Elena sat in her kitchen making tomorrow's to-do lists, she sometimes wondered if she was fighting a battle she couldn't win. The military was an institution with centuries of tradition, established hierarchies, accepted ways of doing business. Elena was one woman with a troublesome tendency to document misconduct and a dangerous habit of treating enlisted soldiers like human beings deserving of dignity. But then she would remember Maria's letter, her grandmother's stories, her mother's quiet strength. She would remember the girls in her self-defense classes, learning that they didn't have to accept violence as inevitable. She would remember Private Jackson's gratitude when Elena made sure his training accident was properly investigated. She would remember all the small victories that didn't make headlines, but changed individual lives. Elena had learned that justice rarely arrived like thunder, dramatic and unmistakable. More often, it arrived like dawn, slowly, subtly, requiring patience and faith that light would eventually overcome darkness. But dawn always came, eventually, if you were willing to stay awake long enough to witness it. Tomorrow morning, Elena would wake at 0500 hours, make her coffee, check on her plants, and prepare for another day of carrying contradictions. She would stand in formation with 429 soldiers, many of whom depended on her to be both strong enough to protect them and wise enough to choose her battles carefully. Tomorrow morning, Elena would face Commander Blackwood and his cold winter eyes, and she would have to decide whether this was the moment for strategic silence or the moment for strategic truth-telling. Tonight, though, Elena sat in her kitchen and wrote in her journal, documenting not just events but emotions, not just facts, but the complex texture of a life lived at the intersection of personal integrity and institutional loyalty. "Some battles choose you," she wrote, "and when they do, the only real choice is how you'll fight them." The confrontation began with paperwork, as most military battles do. Elena had submitted her monthly unit readiness report on a Tuesday morning in October, the same comprehensive document she'd been filing for 2 years. But this time, Commander Blackwood called her into his office within hours, the report spread across his desk like evidence at a court-martial. "Captain Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone men used when they wanted to sound reasonable while being anything but, "we need to discuss some discrepancies in your reporting." Elena stood at attention in front of his desk, her eyes fixed on a point just above his head where a photograph of the president hung slightly crooked. The office smelled of leather and aftershave, and something else, the particular scent of power exercised without accountability. "Discrepancies, sir." Blackwood lifted the report, his manicured fingernails tapping against the paper. "Your assessment of Private Jackson's fitness for duty, you rate him as exemplary, despite his recent medical leave." Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Jackson's medical leave was the result of injuries sustained during what Blackwood had termed intensive corrective training, a euphemism for what civilian courts would have called assault. Elena had documented every bruise, every questionable explanation, every witness statement that didn't quite match the official record. "Private Jackson returned to duty with full medical clearance, sir. His performance since returning has been consistently superior."
"Has it?" Blackwood's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Because I have reports suggesting otherwise. Reports suggesting that Private Jackson has been spreading rumors, malicious gossip about his training experience." The word rumors hung in the air between them like a challenge. Elena had learned to recognize this particular dance, the way powerful men reframed truth-telling as gossip, accountability as insubordination, documentation as disloyalty. "I am not aware of any gossip, sir, but if you have specific concerns about Private Jackson's conduct, I'd be happy to address them through proper channels." Blackwood set the report down, his movements deliberate and theatrical. "That's exactly what I'm talking about, Captain. This formality, this insistence on proper channels. Sometimes leadership requires more direct approaches." Elena felt something cold and familiar settle in her stomach. She'd heard this argument before, from men who believed that rules were suggestions and power was its own justification. Her father had made similar arguments back when he still came home drunk but not yet dangerous, explaining why sometimes you had to handle problems with your hands instead of your words. The next incident came 3 days later during a routine training exercise in the motor pool. Elena was reviewing maintenance schedules with Sergeant Rodriguez when she heard raised voices from across the lot. Turning, she saw Lieutenant Garrison, one of Blackwood's protégés, standing uncomfortably close to Corporal Martinez, his finger jabbing toward her chest as he spoke. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. Martinez's shoulders were rigid with suppressed anger, her hands clenched at her sides. Garrison was using his height advantage, leaning over her in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Lieutenant Garrison," Elena said as she approached, her voice carrying just enough to be heard clearly. "Is there a problem with the maintenance schedule?" Garrison turned, his face flushed with anger and something else, embarrassment at being interrupted. "No problem, Captain. Just discussing performance standards with Corporal Martinez." Elena looked at Martinez, noting the tight line of her mouth, the way she held herself like someone prepared for a fight. "Corporal, do you have any questions about the performance standards?" "No, ma'am. The standards are very clear." Elena nodded, then turned back to Garrison. "Excellent. Then I'm sure we can wrap up this discussion and return to our scheduled activities." It wasn't until later that evening that Elena learned what Garrison had actually been discussing. Martinez knocked on Elena's office door just after 1800 hours, her usually confident demeanor replaced by something more fragile. "Permission to speak freely, Captain." Elena gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Always, Corporal. What's on your mind?" Martinez sat down, then seemed to struggle with how to begin. "Lieutenant Garrison asked me, he wanted to know if I was interested in earning some extra money." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "Extra money how?" "He said there were opportunities for female soldiers who were willing to be friendly with visiting officers. He said it was a tradition, that it would be good for my career if I participated."
The room seemed to grow smaller around them. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could taste the metallic flavor of anger mixed with something that might have been fear. She'd suspected this kind of thing was happening, but suspicion and proof were different animals entirely. Did he specify what kind of friendliness he was referring to? Martinez nodded, her cheeks burning with humiliation. "He was very specific, ma'am, and when I told him I wasn't interested, he said I might want to reconsider. He said soldiers who didn't support unit morale sometimes found themselves facing disciplinary action." Elena reached for a notepad, her movements careful and controlled. "Corporal, I need you to tell me everything he said, as exactly as you can remember it. And I need you to know that reporting this was the right thing to do, regardless of what happens next." But what happened next was not what Elena had expected. Her formal complaint about Garrison's conduct disappeared from the system 3 times. Each time Elena resubmitted it, she was told there had been a computer error or filing mistake. Each time the complaint vanished without explanation or follow-up. Meanwhile, soldiers in Elena's unit began receiving unexpected duty assignments. Private Jackson was transferred to sanitation duty despite his exemplary performance record. Corporal Martinez was assigned to midnight guard shifts that interfered with her college classes. Sergeant Rodriguez found himself facing a surprise inspection of his living quarters that resulted in minor infractions that went on his permanent record. The message was clear. Elena's soldiers were paying the price for her inconvenient commitment to proper channels and formal procedures. The breaking point came during a base-wide inspection in November. Elena was leading a group of visiting officers through her unit's equipment storage when Commander Blackwood appeared, flanked by 2 of his loyal lieutenants. "Captain Vasquez," Blackwood announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I understand there have been some concerns about your unit's discipline standards." Elena felt the attention of the visiting officers focus on her like a spotlight. "Sir, my unit consistently exceeds performance benchmarks in all measured categories." "Performance benchmarks," Blackwood repeated, making the words sound somehow suspect. "Tell me, Captain, how do you measure loyalty? How do you quantify respect for authority?" The visiting officers, a colonel from division headquarters and 2 majors Elena didn't recognize, watched the exchange with the careful neutrality of people who understood they were witnessing something more complex than a routine inspection. "Sir, I measure loyalty through results. My soldiers complete their missions, support their teammates, and maintain the highest standards of conduct." Blackwood stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone that somehow managed to be both quieter and more menacing. "And what about soldiers who spread malicious gossip, who undermine unit cohesion with unfounded complaints? How do your benchmarks measure that kind of disloyalty?" Elena felt the moment crystallizing around them. The visiting officers were paying attention now, their casual interest replaced by the focused attention of people who recognized they might be witnessing something significant. Her own soldiers were within earshot, pretending to focus on equipment maintenance while obviously listening to every word. This was not just about her anymore. This was about every soldier who had ever been harassed, every complaint that had ever been buried, every young person who had joined the military believing they were entering an institution that would protect them from the very behaviors it often protected instead. "Sir," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the storage area, "I measure loyalty by whether soldiers feel safe reporting misconduct through proper channels. I measure respect by whether leaders earn it through their actions rather than demanding it through their rank." The silence that followed was profound and dangerous. She could hear her own heartbeat, could see the flush creeping up Blackwood's neck, could feel the collective breath-holding of everyone within earshot. Blackwood's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I think we need to continue this conversation in private, Captain. My office, now." But before Elena could respond, Colonel Harrison, the visiting officer from Division, stepped forward and said, "Actually, Commander, I'd like to hear more about Captain Vasquez's approach to measuring loyalty. It sounds innovative."
Elena felt something shift in the air around them, a subtle rebalancing of power dynamics. Blackwood's face went through several interesting color changes as he realized he'd overplayed his hand in front of senior officers who might not share his particular leadership philosophy. "Of course, Colonel," Blackwood said, his voice now carefully neutral. "Captain Vasquez has always been thorough in her assessments." But Elena could see it in his eyes, the cold rage of a man who had been challenged in front of witnesses, who would not forget or forgive the embarrassment of being questioned by someone he considered his subordinate. That night, Elena sat in her apartment, making notes in her journal, documenting not just the day's events, but the patterns she could see emerging. Blackwood was escalating, moving from subtle intimidation to open confrontation. Her soldiers were being targeted with increasing frequency and creativity. The informal support network she'd built within the unit was being systematically dismantled through transfers, duty reassignments, and bureaucratic harassment. Elena understood that she was approaching a point of no return. She could continue documenting this conduct through proper channels, watching her reports disappear and her soldiers suffer retaliation. She could request a transfer, remove herself from the situation, and leave her unit to deal with Blackwood without her protection. Or she could prepare for the kind of confrontation that would end with one of them leaving the base permanently. Her phone rang just after 2200 hours. Rodriguez's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Captain, you need to know what happened at the NCO club tonight." Elena listened as Rodriguez described the scene. Garrison and two other officers, drunk and loud, discussing the problem of female soldiers who didn't know their place, describing in graphic detail what they would like to do to teach those soldiers some humility, naming specific women, including Elena. "How many people heard this?" Elena asked. "About 30, ma'am. Mixed crowd, enlisted and officers, men and women. Most people looked pretty uncomfortable, but nobody said anything." Elena thanked Rodriguez and hung up, then sat staring at her reflection in the kitchen window. She could see herself clearly in the glass, a woman in civilian clothes, looking tired but determined, surrounded by the small domestic comforts she'd created to balance the harsh realities of military life. But she could also see beyond her reflection, to the lights of the base in the distance, where 429 soldiers were sleeping in beds they'd earned through service to an institution that claimed to value honor and integrity above all else. Elena made a decision that night, sitting in her kitchen with her grandmother's cross warm against her throat and her sister's final letter tucked into her journal. She would no longer wait for the system to correct itself. She would no longer assume that documentation and proper procedures would eventually result in justice.
Tomorrow, Elena would begin preparing for the confrontation she'd been avoiding, the battle she'd hoped could be won through official channels and professional courtesy. Tomorrow, she would start gathering the kind of evidence that couldn't be lost in computer errors or filing mistakes, the kind of evidence that 429 witnesses could provide, if given the opportunity and the courage to speak truth to power. Elena opened her journal and began to write, not just documenting events, but planning strategy, not just recording injustice, but preparing to confront it head-on. Some battles choose you, she wrote, and when they do, the only real question is whether you'll fight them on your terms or theirs. The next morning brought news that would accelerate everything. Colonel Harrison had submitted a request for Elena's unit to participate in a special training demonstration, a public display of military readiness that would bring together soldiers from across the base in front of senior leadership, visiting dignitaries and local media. 429 soldiers, all in one formation, all watching to see what would happen when institutional power met individual integrity in the bright light of public attention. Elena smiled for the first time in weeks. Sometimes, she realized, the universe provided exactly the stage you needed for the performance of a lifetime. The morning of the demonstration dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp air that made every sound sharper, every color more vivid. Elena woke at 4:30, 30 minutes earlier than usual, and spent the extra time in quiet preparation. She polished her boots until they gleamed like black mirrors, pressed her uniform until every crease was knife-sharp, and checked her appearance with the meticulous attention of someone preparing for the most important performance of her career. In her kitchen, she made coffee and opened her journal one final time before closing this chapter of her life. The pages were filled with months of documentation, dates, times, witnesses, incidents recorded with the precision of someone who understood that details would matter when the moment of truth arrived. Elena traced her finger along the margins, reading her own handwriting like a map of how she'd arrived at this moment. The base was already bustling with unusual activity when Elena arrived at 05:45. Maintenance crews were setting up bleachers for visiting dignitaries, communications specialists were testing sound systems, and military police were conducting security sweeps of the entire demonstration area. The morning air buzzed with the particular energy that comes before significant events, equal parts anticipation and anxiety, hope and dread. Elena found Sergeant Rodriguez already at the equipment staging area, methodically checking weapons and gear with the focused attention of someone who understood that today was different from other days. He looked up as she approached, his dark eyes reflecting the same mixture of determination and concern that Elena felt settling in her own chest. "Morning, Captain," he said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken understanding. "Everything's ready." Elena nodded, scanning the organized chaos of soldiers preparing for what they believed was simply a routine demonstration. "How's morale?" "Solid," Rodriguez replied, then lowered his voice. Words gotten around about what happened at the NCO club, about Garrison's comments. The soldiers are watching to see what happens next. Elena felt the weight of that responsibility settle across her shoulders like a familiar burden. 429 soldiers, each carrying their own stories of harassment ignored, complaints buried, voices silenced. Each one watching to see if this institution they'd sworn to serve would finally live up to its own stated values. At 06:30, the formation began. Elena watched from her position at the front as soldiers filed into their assigned positions with the practiced precision of months of training. But there was something different in their bearing today, a tension, an awareness, as if they could sense the electricity building in the air around them. Private Jackson took his place in the second rank, his young face set with the particular determination of someone who had learned that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of violence. Corporal Martinez stood 3 rows back, her posture perfect, but her eyes alert, scanning the gathering crowd of officers and dignitaries for signs of what was to come. Colonel Harrison arrived at 0645, accompanied by 2 brigadier generals Elena didn't recognize, and a woman in civilian clothes who had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. They took their places in the reviewing stand, their presence adding another layer of significance to what everyone had assumed would be a routine military demonstration. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.
Commander Blackwood appeared at precisely 0700, his uniform immaculate, his bearing confident. But Elena could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed once against his thigh before he forced them to stillness. He was prepared for this confrontation too, she realized. He'd been planning his own strategy, gathering his own allies, preparing for the moment when his authority would be challenged in front of witnesses who mattered. "Good morning, soldiers," Blackwood's voice carried across the formation with practiced authority. "Today we demonstrate the discipline, the excellence, the unquestioning loyalty that makes the United States military the finest fighting force in the world." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. The word unquestioning hung in the air like a challenge, a reminder of what Blackwood expected from his subordinates and what Elena had consistently refused to provide. "Military discipline," Blackwood continued, his voice growing stronger, more commanding, "requires absolute trust in the chain of command. It requires soldiers who understand that orders are not suggestions, that leadership decisions are not open for debate, that loyalty means accepting authority without reservation." Elena could feel the attention of the formation shifting, could sense the collective recognition that this speech was directed at someone specific. The visiting dignitaries leaned forward slightly in their seats, their casual interest replaced with the focused attention of people who recognized they might be witnessing something significant. "But recently," Blackwood's voice took on a harder edge, "there have been questions about whether some officers truly understand what military discipline requires. Questions about whether some leaders are more interested in political correctness than practical results." Elena felt her pulse quicken. This was it, the moment she'd been preparing for, the confrontation she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. She could step back now, accept the implicit challenge in silence, allow Blackwood to make his point without resistance. Or she could do what her sister's letter had asked her to do, use her voice, even when it shook. Elena took a half step forward, her movement small but unmistakable in the rigid formation. "Sir, permission to address the formation." The silence that followed was profound and dangerous. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could see Blackwood's face cycle through surprise, anger, and cold calculation. In the reviewing stand, Colonel Harrison leaned forward, his expression unreadable but attentive. "Colonel Vasquez, this is not the appropriate time for questions." "I'm not asking a question, sir. I'm requesting permission to address misconceptions about military discipline that may be confusing some of our soldiers." Elena could feel the collective intake of breath from 429 witnesses. She was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, challenging authority in front of the entire base, in front of visiting dignitaries, in front of media representatives who had come to film what they thought would be a routine military demonstration. Blackwood's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Very well, Captain. Please enlighten us about military discipline." Elena turned to face the formation, seeing the faces of soldiers who had trusted her to protect them, who had come to her with stories of harassment and discrimination, who had watched their complaints disappear into bureaucratic black holes while their tormentors received promotions and praise. "Military discipline," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the field,
is not about unquestioning obedience to authority. It's about unquestioning commitment to the values this institution claims to represent. She could see Blackwood's face from her peripheral vision, could watch the flush creeping up his neck as she continued. True military discipline means protecting the soldiers under your command, not exploiting them. It means ensuring that every person who wears this uniform is treated with the dignity and respect their service deserves, regardless of their gender, their ethnicity, or their willingness to remain silent when they witness misconduct. Elena turned back to face Blackwood, her voice growing stronger with each word. Military discipline means holding leaders accountable to the same standards we demand from every private in the ranks. It means creating an environment where soldiers feel safe reporting problems through proper channels, knowing their concerns will be investigated fairly rather than buried or ignored. The formation was absolutely silent now, 429 soldiers hanging on every word. In the reviewing stand, Colonel Harrison was taking notes, his expression unreadable but intent. Blackwood stepped forward, his face twisted with rage, barely held in check. "Captain Vasquez, you are out of line. You will report to my office immediately for what, sir?" Elena interrupted, her voice cutting across his like a blade. "For speaking about the values this institution claims to uphold? For suggesting that soldiers deserve better than having their complaints disappear in mysterious computer errors? For implying that maybe, just maybe, sexual harassment and discrimination aren't acceptable training techniques?" Elena could see the moment when Blackwood lost control. His face went from red to purple, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body radiating the kind of barely contained violence that Elena had learned to recognize in her father's face, in the faces of men who believed their authority gave them the right to hurt people who challenged them. "You insubordinate," Blackwood started forward, his right hand rising as if to strike her. Elena didn't think, didn't plan, didn't consider consequences or career implications or the fact that 429 soldiers and dozens of senior officers were watching. She simply moved, her body acting on instincts honed through years of self-defense training, muscle memory developed through countless hours teaching teenage girls how to protect themselves from men who believed their size and anger gave them the right to hurt smaller, weaker opponents. Blackwood's fist was still rising when Elena stepped inside his reach, her left hand deflecting his arm while her right hand found his wrist. She twisted, using his momentum against him, and suddenly Commander Marcus Blackwood was on his knees in the dirt, his arm bent at an angle that made continuing his attack impossible without risking serious injury. The silence was absolute. Elena could hear the flag snapping in the wind overhead, could smell the scent of dust and diesel fuel, and 429 people collectively holding their breath. "Sir," Elena said, her voice perfectly calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system, "I believe you were about to strike a subordinate officer in front of the entire formation. I trust that's not the kind of military discipline you wanted to demonstrate today." Elena turned back to face Blackwood, her hands at her sides, her posture at attention. Blackwood scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of humiliation and rage, his uniform disheveled, his authority shattered in front of everyone who mattered. You, Blackwood stammered, but Elena could see that he'd lost more than just his physical balance. He'd lost the intangible but crucial element that made his authority real, the collective belief that he deserved the power he wielded. Colonel Harrison rose from his seat in the reviewing stand, his movement drawing every eye in the formation. Colonel Blackwood, his voice carrying across the field with unmistakable authority. "I think we need to discuss what just happened here."
Elena felt something shift in the air around them, a fundamental rebalancing of power dynamics that had been building for months. She could see it in the faces of her soldiers, surprise giving way to something that looked like hope, fear being replaced by the recognition that someone had finally said what they'd all been thinking, done what they'd all been wishing someone would do.
Private Jackson's face was bright with tears he was trying not to shed. Corporal Martinez was standing straighter than Elena had seen her stand in months. Sergeant Rodriguez was nodding almost imperceptibly, his expression mixing pride with the kind of relief that comes when justice arrives after a long and difficult wait. But Elena also knew that this moment was just the beginning. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, challenged an authority structure that wouldn't simply accept her defiance and move on. The real battle, the investigation, the formal proceedings, the institutional response to what had just happened, was still to come. Elena stood at attention in the center of the formation, her hands steady, her breathing controlled, her conscience clear. She'd made her choice, finally and irrevocably. She'd chosen her soldiers over her career, truth over convenience, integrity over institutional loyalty. She'd chosen to fight back. The investigation began within hours. Elena found herself seated across from Colonel Harrison and two investigators from the Inspector General's office in a sterile conference room that smelled of fresh paint and institutional disinfectant. The recording equipment hummed quietly on the table between them, documenting every word of what would become the most thorough review of command conduct in the base's recent history. "Colonel Vasquez," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carefully neutral, "we need you to walk us through the events leading up to this morning's incident." Elena had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed the facts in her mind until they formed a coherent narrative that was both absolutely truthful and strategically devastating. She spoke for 3 hours, methodically laying out months of documented harassment, buried complaints, systematic retaliation, and institutional indifference. She provided names, dates, witness statements, and supporting evidence with the precision of someone who had never stopped believing that documentation and truth would eventually matter. The investigators took notes, asked clarifying questions, and requested copies of reports that Elena had assumed were lost forever. But she could see something in their expressions. Recognition, perhaps, or the particular weariness that comes from discovering that problems you'd hoped were isolated incidents were actually symptoms of systemic dysfunction. "And the physical altercation this morning?" asked Major Chen, one of the IG investigators. "Can you describe your actions and the reasoning behind them?" Elena looked directly into the camera, knowing that this moment would define not just her own future, but the message sent to every soldier who had ever wondered whether reporting misconduct was worth the risk of retaliation. "Commander Blackwood raised his hand to strike me in front of 429 witnesses," Elena said, her voice steady and clear. "I used the minimum force necessary to prevent that assault while ensuring my own safety and maintaining the dignity of the uniform we both wore." What Elena didn't say, what she didn't need to say, was that 429 soldiers had watched a female captain successfully defend herself against a male commander who had lost control of his temper and his authority in the most public way possible. The symbolic power of that moment couldn't be measured in investigation reports or disciplinary actions. The investigations continued for days. Private Jackson sat in the same chair Elena had occupied, his young voice shaking with emotion as he described months of targeted harassment that everyone had known about and no one had been willing to stop. Corporal Martinez provided testimony that was both heartbreaking and damning, detailing not just her own experiences, but the systematic pattern of discrimination that had affected nearly every female soldier on the base. Sergeant Rodriguez's statement was perhaps the most powerful, delivered with the calm authority of someone who'd served for 15 years and understood exactly what he was risking by speaking truth to power. He described a command climate where complaints disappeared, where soldiers were punished for reporting misconduct, where loyalty meant accepting the unacceptable in silence. continuing to serve the soldiers who had supported her through the most difficult period of her military career. Elena's apartment had changed too, filled now with plants given to her by grateful soldiers, photographs of units she'd helped protect from abusive leadership, and books written by women who had fought their own battles against institutional indifference. Her journal, once filled with documentation of injustice and plans for confrontation, now recorded a different kind of story. The slow, difficult, ultimately hopeful process of institutional healing. But perhaps the most significant change was in Elena herself. The woman who had once carried contradictions like spare change, uncomfortable but useful, had found a way to transform those contradictions into something more powerful. The recognition that institutional loyalty and personal integrity didn't have to be enemies. That protecting the values an institution claimed to represent sometimes required challenging the people who led that institution. Elena still taught self-defense classes on Friday evenings, but now the community center had to limit enrollment because so many young women wanted to learn from the captain who had proven that fighting back was possible, even against seemingly insurmountable power. She still woke each morning at 0500 and made coffee while watching the sun rise over mountains that surrounded a base where soldiers now felt safer reporting misconduct, where leaders understood that true authority came from earning respect rather than demanding silence. The investigation had revealed something Elena hadn't fully understood until she saw it documented in official reports. Her actions on that parade ground hadn't just protected her own dignity or even just the soldiers under her direct command. They had sent a message that rippled through the entire military community, reaching soldiers who had given up hope that anyone in authority would ever stand up for them. Major Rodriguez, he'd been promoted after testifying in the investigation, stopped by Elena's office on a Friday afternoon in April, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose faith in justice had been vindicated. "You know, when you stepped forward in formation that morning, I thought you were committing career suicide." Elena smiled, accepting the coffee and thinking about all the ways her career had actually been saved rather than destroyed by her decision to fight back. "And now? Now I think you were committing career resurrection. Not just yours, all of ours. Every soldier who serves under leaders who understand that real authority comes from protecting people rather than controlling them." Elena sipped her coffee and looked out her office window at the parade ground where she'd made the most important decision of her professional life. A new group of recruits was practicing drill formations, their movements still awkward, but their dedication unmistakable. In 6 months or a year, they would be the soldiers counting on leaders to protect them from the kinds of abuse that had once been considered normal, acceptable, just part of military life. But they would serve in a military that had been changed, however incrementally, by the actions of one captain who had refused to accept that institutional loyalty required personal compromise. They would serve under leaders who understood that true discipline came from voluntary respect, rather than enforced submission. Elena finished her coffee and opened her journal, preparing to document not another day of injustice endured, but another day of slowly rebuilding an institution worthy of the people who sacrificed to serve it. "Today," she wrote, "Private Morrison came to my office to report harassment by a sergeant in her unit. 2 years ago, that report might have disappeared in a computer error. Today, it was investigated within 48 hours, the harassment stopped immediately, and the sergeant received counseling that will help him understand why his behavior was unacceptable. Small victories," Elena continued, "but victories nonetheless. Maria would have been proud."
The auditorium at the National War College was filled with the kind of respectful silence that comes before important speeches. Lieutenant Colonel Elena Vasquez, the promotion had been automatic after her testimony before Congress led to sweeping military reforms, stood at the podium looking out at 200 future military leaders,
their faces reflecting the mixture of ambition and uncertainty that defined every generation of officers preparing to take on the weight of institutional responsibility. Elena had been invited to speak as part of a leadership series focused on ethical decision-making in complex situations. The invitation letter had described her as an officer whose actions exemplified the highest standards of military integrity. But Elena knew that most of the students sitting before her had probably seen the video of her confrontation with Commander Blackwood, had studied her case in their ethics classes, had discussed her decision to challenge authority in front of 429 witnesses. Leadership, Elena began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium, is not about commanding perfect soldiers in perfect situations. Leadership is about making hard choices when the stakes are highest and the right path is least clear. She paused, scanning the faces in front of her, seeing her younger self in their eager expressions and uncertain postures. 3 years ago, I stood in front of my unit facing a decision that would define not just my own career, but the kind of leader I wanted to be. I could choose institutional loyalty, remaining silent while soldiers under my command suffered harassment and discrimination, or I could choose personal integrity, speaking out despite the professional risks. Elena clicked to the first slide of her presentation, a photograph of that morning's formation taken moments before everything changed. 429 soldiers in perfect alignment, their faces showing the trust they'd placed in their leaders to protect them, guide them, ensure their service meant something worthy of their sacrifice. What I learned that day, Elena continued, is that institutional loyalty and personal integrity don't have to be enemies. The military is strong not when its leaders demand unquestioning obedience, but when its leaders earn trust by protecting the values that make service meaningful. A young captain in the third row raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you balance speaking up against misconduct with maintaining unit cohesion and chain of command?" Elena smiled, remembering asking similar questions when she was a young officer, trying to navigate the complex expectations of military leadership. The chain of command works best when every link is strong. Leaders who abuse their authority don't strengthen the chain, they weaken it. Soldiers who witness misconduct and remain silent don't preserve unit cohesion, they enable the very behaviors that destroy trust and morale. After the speech, Elena was approached by a young lieutenant whose name tag read Martinez. No relation to Corporal Martinez from her unit, but the coincidence still made Elena smile. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said, her voice carrying the particular intensity of someone asking a question that mattered deeply. "What do you do when speaking up seems impossible? When you're junior, when you don't have witnesses, when you know the system is designed to protect the people hurting you?" Elena looked at this young officer, seeing in her face the same mixture of idealism and pragmatism that Elena had carried through her own early military career. You document everything. You find allies. You remember that institutional change happens slowly, but it does happen when enough people refuse to accept the unacceptable. Elena reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card. And you remember that you're not alone. There are people throughout this institution who believe it can be better than it is, who are willing to support officers who have the courage to demand that it live up to its own stated values.
5 years later. The ceremony took place on the same parade ground where Elena had made her stand against Commander Blackwood, but the base looked different now. The old barracks had been renovated with better lighting and improved security features. The mess hall served food that reflected the diverse backgrounds of the soldiers who ate there. Most importantly, the command climate had fundamentally shifted. Soldiers felt safe reporting misconduct. Leaders understood that their authority came with accountability, and the base had become a model for military installations across the country. Elena, now a full colonel and base commander herself, stood before a formation of 600 soldiers. The base had grown, attracting high-performing personnel who wanted to serve under leaders known for integrity and fairness. Today's ceremony was special. The official dedication of the Maria Elena Vasquez Center for Military Ethics.
named for Elena's sister, but designed to honor all the people whose voices had been silenced by institutional indifference. The center housed a new training facility where officers learned not just military tactics, but ethical leadership principles. It included a state-of-the-art reporting system that ensured complaints were investigated fairly and transparently. Most importantly, it served as a permanent reminder that the military's greatest strength lay not in its weapons or strategies, but in its commitment to the values that made service worth the sacrifice. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, he'd been promoted 3 more times, stood at Elena's right side as she addressed the formation. To her left stood Colonel Chen, the former lieutenant who had testified alongside Elena during the original investigation and who now served as the center's first director. This center, Elena told the assembled soldiers, represents a simple truth, that institutions are only as strong as their commitment to protecting the people who serve them. Every person who wears this uniform deserves to serve with dignity, to report misconduct without fear of retaliation, to know that their leaders will fight for them as hard as they fight for their country. In the audience, Elena could see faces that told the story of how far they'd all come. Private Jackson, now Staff Sergeant Jackson, had become one of the base's most respected trainers, known for his ability to help struggling soldiers find their confidence and purpose. Former Corporal Martinez was finishing her law degree and planned to become a military attorney specializing in harassment and discrimination cases. But perhaps most meaningfully, Elena could see dozens of young soldiers whose faces reflected something that had been missing from military formations for too long. The confident knowledge that their service was valued, not just for what they could sacrifice, but for who they were as human beings deserving of respect and protection. 10 years later, Elena's retirement ceremony was attended by over 1,000 people, including soldiers she'd served with across 3 decades of military service, officers she'd mentored who now led units across the globe, and civilian advocates who credited her actions with beginning a transformation that extended far beyond the military. The keynote speaker was General Patricia Williams, the first female chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whose own rise through the ranks had been made possible in part by the cultural changes Elena's actions had helped catalyze. 10 years ago, General Williams said, addressing the crowd gathered on what had been renamed Integrity Field, Colonel Vasquez proved that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is challenge the people who claim to represent your country's values. Her courage didn't just protect the soldiers under her command, it helped begin a transformation that has made our entire military stronger, more just, and more worthy of the people who choose to serve.
Elena sat listening to speeches about her legacy, her impact, her contribution to military reform. But her mind kept drifting to quieter moments that had shaped her understanding of what real change looked like. The late-night conversations with soldiers who finally felt safe reporting misconduct. The thank you letters from parents whose children served in units led by officers who understood that authority meant responsibility. The graduation ceremonies where young people received commissions into a military that had become incrementally but meaningfully better than the one Elena had joined 3 decades earlier. After the ceremony, Elena drove to the small community center where she'd taught self-defense classes for so many years. The program had expanded dramatically, now funded by the military as part of its comprehensive approach to preventing sexual assault and harassment. Elena still taught the Friday evening class when she could, working with teenagers who reminded her of herself at that age, uncertain but fierce, carrying the weight of adult problems on young shoulders, learning that strength sometimes meant fighting back and sometimes meant knowing when not to fight. Tonight's class included Maria Santos, a 16-year-old whose confidence had grown dramatically over the 6 months she'd been attending. Elena watched Maria demonstrate a defensive technique to younger students,
her movements precise and controlled, her voice strong as she explained the principles behind the physical movements. "Remember," Maria told the younger girls, "the goal isn't to hurt someone. The goal is to protect yourself and get to safety. But sometimes protecting yourself means showing someone that you're not an easy target, that you won't accept being hurt without fighting back." Elena smiled, hearing echoes of conversations she'd had with her own sister decades earlier. Recognizing the continuity between Maria's sister's fierce commitment to justice and this young woman's growing understanding that strength and compassion weren't opposites, but partners. After class, Elena drove home to the small house she'd bought near the base, its rooms filled with photographs documenting a career spent in service to an institution that had slowly, sometimes reluctantly, learned to be worthy of that service. She made coffee, the same ritual she'd maintained for decades, and sat in her kitchen making notes in a journal that had evolved from documenting injustice to recording the gradual, incremental victories that comprised real institutional change. "Tomorrow," she wrote, "I begin a new chapter, civilian life after 30 years of military service. But the lessons remain the same, that institutions are only as strong as their commitment to protecting the people they claim to serve. That leadership means earning trust through actions rather than demanding obedience through rank. At sometimes, the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against internal failures of integrity and accountability." Elena closed the journal and prepared for sleep, thinking about the young officers who would inherit the military she was leaving behind, an institution that was still imperfect, still struggling with cultural changes decades in the making, but an institution that had proven it could grow, could reform, could become better than it had been. In her bedroom, Elena looked one final time at the photograph on her nightstand, herself and Maria at ages 8 and 10, wearing homemade superhero costumes in their grandmother's backyard. Two girls who believed that justice was possible if you were brave enough to fight for it, strong enough to keep fighting, even when the battle seemed impossible to win. Elena turned off the light and smiled in the darkness, understanding finally that some victories took decades to achieve, but were worth every year of struggle, every risk taken, every moment when someone had to choose between comfort and courage. Outside her window, the lights of the base glowed in the distance, where soldiers slept safely under leaders who understood that true strength came not from the power to hurt people, but from the commitment to protect them. 20 years later, the military academy classroom was filled with first-year cadets studying Elena's case as part of their required coursework on ethical leadership. Professor Martinez, the former corporal whose testimony had helped bring down Commander Blackwood, clicked to a slide showing the famous photograph of Elena's confrontation, frozen at the moment when everything changed.
"What we see here," Professor Martinez explained to her students, "is not just one captain defending herself against an abusive commander. We see the moment when an entire institution was forced to confront the gap between its stated values and its actual practices. Transform. But also the humility of someone who remembered being a frightened 19-year-old private who found courage by watching another woman fight back. Elena Vasquez taught us that institutional loyalty doesn't mean accepting institutional failures," General Kim said in the film's closing segment. "It means holding institutions accountable to their highest ideals, even when that accountability comes at personal cost." The documentary included interviews with dozens of soldiers whose careers had been shaped by Elena's example. Staff Sergeant Jackson, now preparing for retirement after 27 years of service, spoke about how Elena's mentorship had taught him that true strength came from protecting people rather than controlling them. Colonel Chen, now commanding her own base, discussed how Elena's emphasis on documentation and systematic change had influenced her own approach to leadership. "She taught us that individual heroism wasn't enough," Chen said. "Real change required institutional transformation, and institutional transformation required people willing to do the slow, difficult work of changing systems rather than just challenging individual bad actors." But perhaps the most powerful segment featured Maria Santos, now Dr. Santos, a psychologist who specialized in helping trauma survivors reclaim their sense of agency and power.
She spoke directly to the camera, her voice steady and confident. "I was 16 when I first met Colonel Vasquez at a community center self-defense class. I was dealing with harassment at school, feeling powerless and scared. Elena taught me that fighting back didn't mean becoming violent. It meant refusing to accept violence as normal, as something I just had to endure." Dr. Santos paused, her eyes reflecting decades of helping other people find their own strength. "That lesson changed my life, and through my work, it's changed hundreds of other lives. Elena showed me that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is refuse to stay silent when silence enables harm." The film's final scene showed the current iteration of the community center's self-defense program, now led by volunteers from the local military base as part of their community outreach requirements. Young women practiced the same techniques Elena had taught decades earlier, their movements confident and purposeful. The instructor, a young captain who had never met Elena but had studied her methods, addressed the class with words that echoed across generations. "Remember, your safety matters. Your voice matters. You have the right to protect yourself, and you have the responsibility to speak up when you see others being harmed." 40 years later. The retirement home was quiet in the afternoon sun, its gardens carefully tended by residents who found peace in nurturing growing things. Elena, now 84 years old, sat in her favorite chair by the window, reading letters from former soldiers who still wrote to update her on their lives, their careers, their families. Today's mail included a letter from the great-niece of Private Jackson, now beginning her own military career as a second lieutenant. The young woman wrote about how her great-uncle's stories of Elena's leadership had inspired her to seek a commission, how she hoped to continue the tradition of officers who understood that authority meant responsibility. Elena's health was failing. The doctors spoke gently about declining kidney function and the natural progression of age. But her mind remained sharp, her memories clear. She still kept a journal, though her handwriting had grown shaky and the entries were shorter now. "Today marks the 40th anniversary of the morning that changed everything," she wrote in careful script. "I think often now about the young captain who stood in formation that day, uncertain but determined, carrying the weight of promises made to a dying sister and the hopes of soldiers who deserved better leadership." I wonder if she understood in that moment that she was not just defending herself, but opening a door that could never be closed again, that her actions would inspire legislation, change policies, influence generations of leaders who had never heard her name but inherited the culture her courage helped create. Elena paused in her writing, looking out at the garden where other residents moved slowly among flowers that bloomed and faded with the seasons. She thought about Maria, gone now for over 50 years, but whose fierce commitment to justice lived on in every person who found the courage to speak truth to power. The door to Elena's room opened softly, and a young woman entered carrying a bouquet of flowers. Elena recognized her immediately, though they had never met. She had her grandmother's eyes and her great-grandmother's determined jawline. "Colonel Vasquez," the young woman said, her voice carrying the particular nervousness of someone meeting a personal hero. "I'm Lieutenant Sofia Rodriguez. My grandmother served with you, Sergeant Major Rodriguez." Elena smiled, remembering Rodriguez's steady presence during the most difficult period of her military career, his unwavering support when she needed allies most desperately. "Sophia, your grandmother wrote to me about you. How is your training going?" Sophia sat in the chair beside Elena's bed, her posture reflecting the discipline of military training, but her expression showing the openness of someone still forming her understanding of what service meant. "It's challenging," Sophia admitted, "but I keep thinking about the stories Grandpa Rodriguez told me about you, about how you taught him that real leadership meant protecting people,
not controlling them. Elena nodded, understanding that she was looking at the continuation of something that had begun 40 years earlier on a parade ground where 429 soldiers had watched history change. "Your grandfather was one of the bravest people I ever served with," Elena said, her voice still strong despite her physical frailty. "He stood up when standing up meant risking his career. He spoke truth when truth was dangerous. He helped create the military you're serving in now." Sophia leaned forward, her eyes intense with the particular focus of someone seeking guidance for challenges not yet fully understood. "Colonel, how do you know when it's time to fight, when the risk is worth taking?" Elena looked at this young woman, seeing in her face the same mixture of idealism and pragmatism that had defined Elena's own early military career. She thought about the question, considering decades of experience and the lessons learned through both victory and failure. You fight when staying silent becomes more painful than speaking up. You fight when you realize that your comfort is less important than other people's safety. You fight when you understand that institutions are only as strong as the people willing to hold them accountable to their own stated values. Elena reached into the drawer beside her bed and pulled out a small silver cross, the same one she had worn for decades, the one that belonged to her sister Maria. Her hands shook slightly as she offered it to Sophia. "This belonged to someone who believed that justice was possible if you were brave enough to fight for it," Elena said. "I've carried it through every difficult decision I ever made. Perhaps it's time for someone else to carry it forward." Sophia accepted the cross with reverence, understanding that she was receiving not just a piece of jewelry, but a legacy of courage, integrity, and unwavering commitment to protecting people who needed protection.
As the afternoon sun slanted through the window, Elena felt a deep sense of completion. The young captain who had stood in formation 40 years earlier, uncertain but determined, had become part of something larger than herself, a tradition of leadership that would continue long after her own story ended. Elena closed her eyes and smiled, thinking about 429 soldiers who had witnessed the moment when silence was finally broken, when someone found the courage to fight back, when justice arrived not like thunder, but like dawn, slowly, subtly, but inevitably illuminating everything it touched. The room was quiet now, filled with the peaceful silence of a life fully lived, a mission completed, a promise kept to a dying sister who had believed that justice was possible if you were brave enough to never stop fighting for it. Outside Elena's window, the sun continued its ancient journey across the sky, bringing light to new places, new people, new battles that would require the same courage Elena had found within herself on a parade ground where everything changed because one person refused to accept that institutional power was more important than individual dignity. 50 years later, the military academy's newest building bore Elena's name, its walls lined with photographs documenting 5 decades of institutional change that could be traced back to one captain's refusal to accept the unacceptable. The Elena Vasquez Center for Ethical Leadership had become the model for similar programs throughout the military, a testament to the enduring power of individual courage to transform entire institutions. On the wall beside the main entrance, a bronze plaque displayed Elena's most famous quote, the words she had spoken to that formation of 429 soldiers on a morning that changed everything. True military discipline means holding leaders accountable to the same standards we demand from every private in the ranks. Below the quote, in smaller text, were the words Elena had requested for her memorial. She stood up so others could stand tall. Cadets passed the plaque daily, most pausing to read the words, understanding that they were preparing to serve in an institution that had been fundamentally transformed by the actions of people who had chosen integrity over convenience, courage over comfort, and truth over institutional loyalty. The military Elena had left behind was not perfect, no institution ever was, but it was measurably, demonstrably better than the one she had entered as a young lieutenant 6 decades earlier.
Sexual harassment and discrimination had not been eliminated entirely, but they were no longer tolerated, ignored, or accepted as inevitable parts of military culture. More importantly, Elena's story had become part of the institution's DNA, taught to every new officer as an example of how individual actions could transform entire organizations. Her name was invoked alongside those of famous generals and war heroes, but she was remembered not for battles won against foreign enemies, but for the battle she had fought against domestic failures of leadership and accountability. In classrooms around the world, her story was taught as a case study in ethical decision-making. In corporate boardrooms, executives learned about the importance of creating cultures where employees felt safe reporting misconduct. In community centers, young people learned that they had the right to speak up when they witnessed injustice, that their voices mattered, that silence in the face of wrongdoing was its own form of violence.
Sometimes, justice arrives, not like thunder, dramatic and unmistakable, but like dawn, slowly, subtly, requiring patience and faith that light will eventually overcome darkness. And sometimes, that dawn illuminates not just individual lives, but entire institutions, entire cultures, entire generations of people who inherit a world made incrementally but meaningfully better by those who came before them. The story of Captain Elena Vasquez ended on a parade ground where 429 soldiers watched history change. But the impact of her courage, her integrity, her refusal to stay silent in the face of injustice, that story continues to unfold, carried forward by every person who finds the strength to fight back, to speak up, to demand that the institutions they serve be worthy of their sacrifice. In the end, Elena's greatest victory was not defeating Commander Blackwood in front of hundreds of witnesses. It was proving that individual courage could transform institutional culture, that silence was not strength, that fighting back was not just possible, but necessary. It was proving that justice, however slowly it might arrive, was always worth fighting for. Subscribe to She Stood First, where silence is never forgotten.